Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. Today's episode is about a Phish show, to be sure, but in the larger picture, it's about an entire tour. Today's guest, Jordan Kahn, chose to tell his story from June 16th, 2000, when Phish played Zepp Suminoe-ku in Osaka, Japan. 4 years into this podcast, it's not often that a guest chooses a show from a tour that has not yet been covered. But Jordan saw nearly every show from the Japan 2000 tour, and man, I was excited to hear all about it. In retrospect, we all know that just a few months after Phish played Japan in 2000, they would go on a year-and-a-half-long hiatus. When listening to this show and others from the tour, they don't sound tired or as if they need to stop the Phish touring machine. Maybe it was being in small clubs with a quiet, respectful audience that provided the band with the relaxing feel that it allowed them to experiment toward the beatless, futuristic, ambient sound that would dominate 2000. But that's all speculation. Let's stick to what we know. Jordan provides us with a personal but universal experience of what it was like to travel from the United States to the land of the rising sun, and parts of this conversation veer away from the Phish experience and become something of a travelogue with a jam band flavor. So let's join Jordan to talk about bullet trains, superior sushi, and why a day off during the tour is okay as we discuss June 16th, 2000 from Zepp, Osaka. Jordan, welcome to Attendance Bias. How are you?
Konnichiwa, Brian-san. I'm great. I'm happy to be on the podcast.
So, konnichiwa's hello. How do you say, is there like a different phrase for hello back or just konnichiwa, konnichiwa?
Yeah, you can just say it right back.
All right.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
Hi.
Hi. Well, Jordan is here, everyone listening, to talk about a show and a whole tour that has not yet been touched on. And I think for good reason. We're here to talk about June 16th, 2000. And Jordan, I'm going to lean on you a lot today for pronunciations so that I don't sound like a fool and I don't offend any Japanese or Japanese speaking listeners. So June 16th, 2000 at Zepp Suminoe-ku, Osaka, Japan. Is that all right?
Suminoe-ku.
Suminoe-ku.
No, Suminoe-ku.
Okay, all right, I'll let you take care of it then when we get to the context section. I'm always excited when someone brings up either a lesser known show or a show or tour, or in some cases, even a year, that still happens, that no other guest has brought up. And you're bringing up part of the Phish 2000 Japanese tour, which consisted of about how many shows? About 8 shows?
It was 7 shows in 8 nights in 4 cities.
Okay, so we have a lot to dig into today. As far as I know, the Japanese tour, what it reflects on me is always good soundboard qualities, or at least if it's audience recordings, always well-recorded shows. It was right around the time that Farmhouse was released, so there was a lot of those songs in the set list. But other than that, I have a million questions for you, so I'm glad that you're here to enlighten me and maybe some of the listeners who might know that Phish played Japan in 1999 and 2000, but really haven't gotten a feel for what it was like to be there. So I'm really glad you're here. But before we get to Japan, let's get to know you here in America with the Attendance Bias Lightning Round.
Attendance Bias Lightning Round.
So Jordan, when was your first Phish show, and what do you remember most about it?
My first Phish show was May 25th, 1994 at the Warfield in San Francisco. And I have a great story about being an usher working the first set. So I was a student at UC Berkeley, and we were all deadheads. And I was skeptical about Phish because I was hearing so much about them, and I was just so deep into the dead world. So I didn't want to buy a ticket. But they had a program for students where you could work as an usher for a show. Then at set break, you got a drink ticket, and you could go wherever you want. So this was a great deal. I wound up seeing a lot of shows at the Warfield like that. So my first set of Phish, I'm on the floor of the Warfield, and my job, Brian, is to tell fans to dance outside of the lines in the aisleway. It was so ridiculous. And there, at one point, I remember a Forbin's Mockingbird, and I just abandoned my post and went up to the rail, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And eventually I went back, and at some point, I think it was Ash, I just gave up, telling the fans to dance outside the lines. The second set was incredible. There was a big ball jam. That's really what stands out to me. And that really, made me a huge Phish fan going forward.
You had me in the first half when you told me it was a really great deal, because it did. And then when you told me what your responsibility was, my impression is that is not an easy job. I work in a middle school, and one of the security members at the middle school, her summer gig is working at Jones Beach. And she always tells me a little bit in advance when Phish is coming to Jones Beach. And when I asked her perspective, what is it like when Phish comes from a security person's point of view? She says it's the easiest night ever because no one gets in fights. If someone gets too drunk, they usually have friends who usually do take care of them. She says from a safety standpoint, it's usually pretty easy, but she says it's the hardest job in the world because her job is to uphold the fire code and keep the aisles clear. And she says at Phish, that's almost impossible. She's like, it's Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the mountain. You just gave up on it eventually.
Right. Exactly. The point was to make the aisles clear in case there was an emergency. But at some point, because given how fans were dancing so feverishly, I just gave up. And I was just a college kid moonlighting for a set. So
right.
If the fire marshal wasn't going to come down on my back.
Well, that was many years ago, 1994, right? I'm not that great at math, but where are we? 30 years, right? At this point?
It's been almost 30 years of seeing Phish.
Yeah. So 30 years ago, what's your most recent Phish show? And what did you think of it?
This is December 29th of last year, 2023, at the Madison Square Garden. And I just loved it. I know you usually ask, what's your most controversial Phish opinion? My favorite material these days is from the Ghosts of the Forest and Lonely Trip albums. I mean, that's why I go to shows. And the 29th this year, they played a song from each in each set. So, I was thrilled. I know some fans disagree, but for me, I get upset if they don't play material from those albums.
I wasn't thrilled with Ghosts of the Forest when it debuted, when Trey was first playing it, mostly with Tab. And then when Phish started playing it, I was lukewarm. But then when I saw Between Me and My Mind, right, the documentary, and it really coalesced with me that the album was about CCOT, right, and what it's like to be with someone, a lifelong friend who dies of cancer, I really started listening closer to the lyrics. And although I'm not going to go to the mattresses for every single song on Ghosts of the Forest, it really changed the dimension in which I see those songs. And I'm no longer, poo-pooing them. Although I will say, About to Run, I've always been a fan of that one.
Yeah, and they played that on the 29th. That's a scorcher. I think you did a segment on Beneath the Sea of Stars. I mean, that is, I just think Ghosts of the Forest is a masterpiece. And I enjoyed a couple of shows from that tour. And now when I see Phish, I'm always pulling for, a big Ruby Waves.
I'm big on Sigma Oasis. Controversial opinion, I think Sigma Oasis is probably their best studio album.
I like Sigma Oasis, but for me, Lonely Trip, something about Trey holding up and focusing and emoting. I mean, I feel like those two albums, Ghost of the Forest, as you mentioned, with the melancholy about losing a friend, a lifelong friend, but then also Lonely Trip about tapping into what we were all feeling with the isolation. It's just, he's come into his own. I mean, he's always been a brilliant, musical scorer, but for many years he was leaning on others for lyrics. And it goes to the Forest. I felt he really, came into his own as a lyricist. And then, with Tom and Scott Herman's help, I think the tracks on Lonely Trip are absolutely brilliant.
So we're here to talk about Japan 2000. We'll get into tons of memories, I hope, of yours. But what is your favorite non-Phish related memory of being in Japan for that week plus?
I only had time for one. So there was only one day off, and I spent it roaming the temple complex in Kyoto, which is Japan's ancient capital. And it's got those famous orange gates. I mean, it's the most tranquil, beautiful place. And it was a real spiritual experience for me to just chill out in the middle of tour, but it's a real bittersweet memory because I had to skip Fukuoka to make it happen. So, my trip was short. I arrived right before the tour started. I left right after. So there was one day off, and I decided to take in some culture instead of traveling halfway across Japan and back. And when I made this decision, it was the fourth night in a row. The fourth show was in Nagoya, 700-person club. I was over the rail, just had a peak experience. After arriving in Japan and having 3 shows in Tokyo, this fourth in Nagoya in this tiny, tiny place. And it was so intense, I needed to pull the ripcord and just stay local. And Kyoto was right next to Nagoya, and Osaka, which had the 2 last shows, including the one I'm going to talk about in the night before, that was like an 800-person club in a shopping mall on the 4th floor. It just made sense to take that day off instead of, taking the train 4 hours all the way to Fukuoka and then 4 hours back, that I could really, enjoy Japan and explore the temples. But it haunted me, right? Missing the epic Drum Logos show. It deserves all of its praise, but I do think that I made the right call in retrospect to include self-care and culture, and not make my trip all about Phish. The irony, though, Brian, is that the way I had justified it to myself was saying, who knows if I will ever be back in Japan? But a decade after the tour, I wound up meeting a Japanese woman. We got married in Japan, and we go back all the time.
If someone was telling you tomorrow I'm going to Japan and you had to recommend one city or one specific place to go, where would you recommend?
Probably Kyoto and the shrines. I mean, I've been back to those shrines since. We're going back this summer. So, I mean, that is really the cultural capital. It's really, the center of Japan. And it's just a marvelous place. But, Tokyo, being a New Yorker, Tokyo, I would highly recommend. And, you have to fly in and out of there anyway. But it's wild. I mean, growing up in Manhattan, I thought I knew big cities. I mean, Tokyo, it kind of kicked my ass, but in a good way. There's just so much to see and do.
A friend of mine who was married to a Japanese woman, and he, like you, would go back and forth, not infrequently. That's kind of the same sentiment he told me about Tokyo. He said, if you think Manhattan is large, imagine like 20 Manhattans spreading in all directions, and you don't know where it begins and where it ends. How often do you go back to Japan?
Well, we try to go back every summer because my kids they go to school there, and because the Japanese school extends into July. When they finish here in June, we take them over and they go in the end of June and all of July. But COVID threw a wrench in that. But
right.
That's we're trying to get back every year. And so, if I'm hoping Phish announces another Japan tour and that I can swing it because I have family over there I can stay with, but having kids, hopefully it would be during the summer when we could make it work.
Did you catch a whiff of those rumors a few months ago when I have to believe that it was photoshopped, that there was that piece of masking tape on a traveling case that said Phish Japan? Did you see those?
They were trying to create some buzz around it, but I thought that might have been tied in with the official release of the show that we're going to talk about.
Oh, maybe that hadn't crossed my mind. Anyway, my next question was going to be, if Phish announced another week-long tour of Japan tomorrow, do you think you'd go? I think you just answered that question. So let's get to the grand finale here. What is the weirdest thing you've ever seen at any Phish show on any continent?
The Flying Hot Dog, New Year's '94. My brother had gotten us tickets way up in the rafters. We're enjoying an incredible New Year's show, all of our first one in our crew, and all of a sudden there's a giant hot dog flying around, and we could not believe ourselves. And what's especially wild is that Trey afterwards said that they had sort of designed the gag for the people up in the rafters. If the Warfield show that summer hadn't really grabbed me, that New Year's show the same year, I mean, that all of a sudden I was just signed on to be a Phish fan for life.
So let's take a look at the Japan tour of 2000. And this is where I might need your help, or definitely will need your help, with some pronunciations, with advance apologies for the pronunciation of some cities and events. But zooming out, 2000 was a very busy year for Phish. They didn't play their first live shows until May, because this was back when spring tours were a little more common. But it seemed like they were promoting Farmhouse, the album, like crazy. And I got a big whiff of this being in New York City, because they played a mini tour in various radio stations in the Northeast. They played that short, small 3-night run in New York City, which were, I think, the 2 nights at Radio City and then a night at the Roseland Ballroom, which by that point were all extremely small venues compared to what Phish could do. They were only getting more popular at the time. And then after they finished their promotion in May, they took on their second visit to Japan. When I say second, just a little context, the band previously played 5 shows at the end of July in 1999, the previous year, at and I'll need your help, the Naiba ski resort in Niigata. How did I do?
Naiba ski resort in Niigata. Close
Okay.
enough.
All right. I'll get partial credit. So that stand was all at the same venue during the Fuji Rock Festival, but the 2000 tour, the one that you attended, was more of a proper tour by our definition, by what we're familiar with. So by the numbers, like you mentioned earlier, they would play 7 distinct shows in 8 days, each at a different venue. What were some of those shows like? Yeah.
Well, yeah, 4 of them were club shows with a capacity of no more than 1,000, and they were each in the center of a different Japanese city. The largest show was the only outdoor one. It was an amphitheater in Hibiya Park, Tokyo, which is kind of like their Central Park, and that was 3,000 capacity. Then there was a pair of Zepp shows at Zepp venues. These are box-like structures on the outskirts of Tokyo and Osaka, and the capacity was around 2,000, and they looked exactly alike. And what's funny is if you get the sound check for this show, for the Osaka, Trey starts riffing on Zepp Osaka looks just like Zepp Tokyo. And it was stunning. I mean, we were all sort of doing a double take walking in.
How did you get around? Because it seems like these venues are very far from one another.
Well, one thing about Japan is it's very well organized, right? So the public transit was, I mean, just to go back to 2000, right? There was no Google Translate, there was no, GPS. So it was a bit of a struggle, but it was great because it was a challenge. And of course, I met lots of other, Phish fans on the tour, Japanese who were helping us, and Americans and Canadians who were, just there for the tour. And we were just, we just did our best. We asked for help. We used maps. The Japanese were very friendly and accommodating, but there was a major language barrier. But again, the transportation made it easy. I mean, once you could kind of figure out the metro system and how to buy a ticket, it was easy to get sort of around these cities. And then from city to city, they have these bullet trains, these high-speed bullet trains. And it was kind of the same idea, once you're on the train, it was great. There was a little touch and go trying to buy the tickets and all that, but we all experienced some frustration getting around, but also tremendous pride in just being able to do it.
I can imagine the pride of once it all works out, like a lock being unlocked or a knot being untied all of a sudden, and now like you're good to go. Looking at the tour itself, I have virtually no context about Phish in Japan. We talked about this a little bit off mic. The only things that I really know is the audience recordings from every show sound great. The venues, like you have said, have been very small, like 800 or just a few hundred. And of course, the band adapted the lyrics to the meat stick to try and impress the locals back in 1999 with maybe mixed results. I don't know. Did you get a sense of how that came off with the meat stick in Japanese?
Yeah, so that was the first night, and it was just hilarious because Trey had, I think, there was a Japanese band called Big Frog that had actually opened for them at the outdoor show, and I think they had helped them kind of write out the lyrics in Japanese, and Trey had them all taped up. Someone from the tour actually, I think, still has them. But it was a goof, right? It was just pure hilarity, and that was it's a nice throwback now. Anytime when they start singing Japanese, I'm instantly brought back to that first night of tour at the On Air East. There's a venue you can pronounce in Shibuya, Tokyo, and it was just a blast. But just talking about the audience recordings, you could hear a pin drop at these shows. I mean, the Japanese fans, they were so into it, but they were really quiet. I mean, that's how they show their appreciation and engagement, is not shouting choruses the way we do, just being very quiet and then sort of clapping politely in between the songs.
Sometimes I wish America could take a lesson. So I'd imagine that most fans are familiar with the Fukuoka twist from June 14th and whatever tapes they can get their hands on once they began to circulate. Other than that, I don't know how popular each show from this tour is. So to give us a little bit more personal background, who were you? What were you doing? What led you to Japan to be one of the few American fans to join them, as opposed to, say, the 1996 or 1997 European tours, which were for Americans probably a lot more accessible. How did you end up in Japan?
Okay, so I guess I'll start with the fall of 1999. And I was in between jobs living on the West Coast, and I saw the first chunk of that tour from Vancouver down to Shoreline, and then started a new job in Lake Tahoe, of all places. That was before Phish was playing there. And it just killed me to miss Big Cypress, right? It was all leading up to that. But I had just started a job all the way across the country. But as soon as I saved up enough vacation time, I was ready to Phish. So I saw one of those Radio City Music Hall shows, and I was all about the Japan tour. From the minute they announced it, I was so excited because at that point I had been to a few different Asian countries, but not Japan, the land of the rising sun. It was sort of, mythical. And I was just, all in. I got tickets to the run as soon as they were announced. And I couldn't wait to get over there for, not just for the shows, but for the experience.
Did you have any trepidation at all? Maybe this is me. Maybe this is my New York neuroses coming out. But you mentioned a little bit earlier a language barrier. And I think you mentioned off my kind of an alphabet barrier. That's something to me. I wouldn't say that I would never do it. That's not my personality either. But I would definitely be a little fearful of it just from feeling like a fish out of water. Is that too personal, or did you face any of that, or were you just, full speed ahead?
Well, as a fellow neurotic New Yorker, I can relate. The one because I went solo, but I had met a Japanese fan at Shoreline, and we stayed in touch, and we actually wound up meeting, but that turned out not to be sort of, the focus of my trip at all, because starting from the terminal at San Francisco Airport, I made friends with Americans and Canadians, and met other people over there. And so some of whom I'm still really good friends with to this day. So that all kind of melted away. But I did have at least sort of this safety net of knowing, one person over there who was going to, at least one of the shows and could help me if need be. But it turns out I didn't really need that safety net, that I was able to navigate and meet all the people that I needed to meet and get to all the places I needed to get. And I think that the sense of adventure trumped the anxiety.
And we just got to remember where we are in 2000. You touched on this earlier. Cell phones exist, but most people did not have them, right? They were not easily accessible. You couldn't just text somebody in a pinch, and you couldn't look anything up, right? So to be in a completely different continent, let alone another country, that's where my head goes first. And then I remember, oh, right, Phish is at the peak of their powers in the summer of 2000. Let's not forget that part of it too. What was the crowd like? You mentioned that you met up with a bunch of Americans and Canadians. Once you were at the shows, was it mostly American fans who were following the band? Were there Japanese fans? What was the breakdown? What do you remember about that?
Yeah, that's what made this so special. It was roughly, at least two-thirds Japanese fans, unlike the European tours that I learned were almost all Americans. And it's just really impressive that Phish at that point had a few hundred fans that would travel across the world to see them, and then have twice as many Japanese fans eagerly awaiting their arrival, many of whom had seen them at Fuji Rock. And the Japanese are really known to get super into things. And Phish was no exception. They knew a lot about the music, and more so, and this was surprising, given how you think of Japanese as being a buttoned up people, they were really into hippie culture, hippie expressionism. They had dreadlocks, they were wearing patchworks. They seemed to already know kind of how we roll, right? They had signs one sign I remember, it said they wanted to hear lizards, but they wrote Rizalds. So making fun of the Japanglish. And then they got it that night. They made stickers. One I remember said Tray Station instead of the Sega PlayStation logo. And they were really friendly. Again, not many of them spoke English, and those who spoke English were not fluent, but they wanted to talk to us about the songs, about Gamehenge, about the Grateful Dead. One of my favorite lines from the whole trip was, I was having a conversation with a guy. He turns to me, he goes, "Trey is ninja, but Jerry is samurai."
As an English teacher, I can say, I don't teach kids for the SATs, but when it comes to analogies, I don't know if they even still have analogies on the SATs, but if they do, I'm going to talk to whichever education publishing company gets on that, because that should definitely be on there. Jerry is samurai as Trey is to ninja.
I could just add that,
Yeah.
we were all of us were so collectively excited about how well the band was playing. And then, the music was just an overlay on being in Japan, which is, such an intensely unique place. And the stimulation, right? The sounds, the food, it was truly a once in a lifetime experience.
What was the best thing you ate?
So Trey says it's all about the noodles, and the noodles were good. But for me, it was all about the sushi.
Do you have a particular role that you would recommend, or do you have like a certain memory that sticks out when you think back to sushi? Is it speaking, because I live in a neighborhood in Queens that is kind of pan-Asian. Like it doesn't matter where on the continent, you could find a very good restaurant that serves a dish from even within a nation, like a small area of that nation, whether it's Cantonese or Mandarin, speaking of China, or Jackson Heights, which is an area also in Queens that is well known for its worldwide fare. Am I eating inferior sushi?
Yes. I mean, the Japanese, and it's very different, right? I mean, I remember being surprised there was no, California rolls, things like that. It's very, very pure, and they're big into the sashimi or the nigiri. There's not really that much of a roll culture, so it was really just pigging out on the conveyor belt sushi, because that was really big. I have some fond memories of just having stacks of those plates going above our heads.
Well, let's speculate for a little bit, getting away from the culture and the culture shock and the culture love for a minute. I'm curious as to why Phish went back over to Japan in 2000. It's a silly thing to question, but I am just curious. My guess is they wanted to play a completely new market, even though they did play a couple of shows in 99. And I'm wondering if maybe they were hoping that Japan would invigorate them in a similar way to as Europe did a few years earlier, because when they came back from Europe in 97 from playing in these small halls and hearing the clink of glasses, and they had to listen a little bit closer to each other because they were that much closer on stage. I wonder, because they were definitely getting tired at the end of 1999, right? Big Cypress, there's that anecdotal story of Fishman leaning over to Trey and saying, we should quit or we should stop now. I was wondering if going to Japan was kind of new territory for them, maybe looking for inspiration somewhere that's completely foreign to them, and at the same time exposing their music to a new consumer base. I have no idea if that's true, but it should be worth noting that 4 months after this show was played, they went on hiatus.
I think your theory is spot on. I agree wholeheartedly. Right? They wanted to build the fan base from Fuji Rock, because they had played 5 nights at that festival, playing in front of Japanese music fans from all over that country. So it was a natural stepping stone to then do a tour, and I think it was a great way to have a real intimate tour. Right? I mean, Cypress was not intimate. And then when they came with the summer tour proper in the States, at that point they were already playing huge venues. I think this gave them a chance to really, listen to one another and play in these tiny venues, get their sound and their act together. And they probably knew the hiatus was on the horizon, is my sense.
Before we break down the show, any last memories that you've always wanted to tell about Phish in Japan but haven't had the chance to?
Well, I mean, the one big one that I was going to save for when we get to Character Zero, but I might as well say it now. It was the most epic thing was when they played the outdoor show, Hibiya. It was drizzling the whole day, right? The one day it rained was the outdoor venue, right? Just our luck. So we were all kind of wearing ponchos. It didn't prevent us from enjoying the show, but then all of a sudden, the clouds, the encore, they come out for Character Zero, the clouds part, right? There's a giant rainbow and it lands right in the amphitheater. And you can actually see this on YouTube. There's a pro shot video of it. And it was just, I mean, all of us, we just couldn't believe what we were seeing. It's before, Shapiro orchestrated the Fare Thee Well rainbow. There was the Hibiya rainbow. And one of the best lines of tour, now I didn't hear this, but it's been passed along to me, is that a Japanese guy grabbed an American fan and said, "Trey Magic Man, he Red Wizard, he Sky Owner," as if we all knew that this band was so transcendent that they were affecting the weather.
Set 1.
Well, let's take a look at this show. So June 16th, 2000 at Zepp Suminoe-ku in Osaka. The show opens with Limb by Limb, which is not new, but it still hasn't quite expanded yet. And you can tell it's an audience recording, although it does sound like a Matrix recording. That's how clear it is. Wikipedia says the capacity of this venue, if I've looked up the right one, because as you mentioned, I know that Zepp is kind of like a franchise name, that there are several venues that share that name and they even look identical. But if I found the right information, the capacity is about 1,800. Is that about right? Is that the sense that you got? I'm very bad with spatial reasoning.
Yeah, that sounds right. I think the Tokyo Zepp was a little bit bigger at 2,500, but that sounds right.
And this Limb by Limb, to me, kind of sets the precedent for what a lot of the 2000 sound of Phish is like. It always starts pretty tight. It gets a little bit looser after the jam starts. And eventually, if not sooner, then a little bit later, you're going to hit very electronic. I don't know if EDM is pushing it too far, but a lot of beeps and boops and a lot of ambience with kind of no center unless Fishman happens to be holding it down on his cymbals, not necessarily his snare drum or his bass drum. So they get pretty down low only 4 minutes into the song, and they're just kind of poking around for a while. And it sounds kind of like a usual Limb by Limb at around 7 minutes, but then the tone switches. And that's to me when 2000 Phish hits.
Yeah, I totally agree. From the midpoint of this song onwards, this is when you hear the signature Japan tour sound. It's orderly, unrushed, mindful, for lack of a better word, zen. So the Drum Logos show was drenched in this sound, but you hear it throughout the tour, where the band incorporates cultural features into the music. And I think for me, that's my attendance bias for this run, is because, they're playing to and incorporating, elements of the culture with the Japanese crowd. Not only this sort of, patient, deliberate sound, but also you mentioned beeps and bloops. Japan is so futuristic. And so there was a lot of that going on. And it was just, this jam, this Limb by Limb opener absolutely encapsulates this sound that goes throughout the whole tour. And they would use that as a jumping point, for the rest of the year. but I think it became a little bit more sort of aggressive and showy when it got back to the States. Here it was a little bit more restrained. And one really cool thing about the opener was that Limb by Limb had been the closer at Tokyo Zepp. So it was clearly, consciously closing the loop between the venues and giving a nod to how similar they were, that Trey was kind of obsessing over in the sound check. I always liked this song. It's cool that it references the Chinese wall that we weren't too far from. And the never turned my brain to mush line was funny because at this point, our minds were just, splattered from overstimulation, travel, partying, lack of sleep. Again, this was, the seventh show in 8 nights in 4 different cities.
Yeah, that's a lot to take in. What I liked about this also, kind of to your point, is this Limb by Limb. I don't know, I'll have to check it, but I think it's the longest song in the set. And that rarely happens with the opener, with song number 1. Like this has an amazing back and forth between some grooves, like around 9 minutes. There is a pretty straightforward groove. Like it's not very powerful, but it is something to settle. But then by around 11 minutes, they're in what I call the Brian Eno mind space. Like they really just kind of not quite shoegaze, but that's the first word that comes to mind. And then there's this droning and Machine Gun Trey at the same time. I mean, it's a heck of a way to start a show before diving right into Back on the Train, which is a complete change of tone.
Yeah, Back on the Train. That was, if there was a theme song, this was it. This was the 3rd time they had played it. And again, we were all zipping all over the country on these bullet trains. And of course, the lyric ideas that would take me all around the world. I mean, you couldn't help but just, smile when he played, listening to that in Japan.
What was it like on the bullet trains? How are they different or how are they similar to like trains, whether it's commuter rails or subways in America?
Well, I mean, they're much faster. I mean, you can almost feel a little bit of warbling when you go. And so that's, to me, that, especially I'm doing a lot of commuting between DC and New York, and it would, it would be, if we had the technology that they had in Japan, it would be a lot quicker and it's a lot quieter. I mean, that was really the main difference from like the Amtrak here is they're twice as fast and twice as quiet.
After Back on the Train is Sample in a Jar. To me, this is a standard sample in a jar. It's telling, and you mentioned this earlier when I listened to this, because I don't think I'd heard this show before you brought it up. I'm always so used to hearing the big sing-along for the chorus, and I don't hear much sing-along at all on this audience recording.
That's right. And it wasn't because they didn't know the words. It was because the way that they expressed their enthusiasm is by not making noise.
I wish my students would be able to do the same thing.
Well, let's put it this way. There was no chompers on this tour, and we've all been there.
So after Sample in a Jar, between Back on the Train, Sample in a Jar, and then there's First Tube, and then even Golgi Apparatus, it seems like after that very long experimental droning beeps and boops opener of Limb by Limb, it seems like we're facing kind of not a jukebox set, but a lot of like standalone songs. Although this First Tube reaches about 10 minutes. This is not a standard First Tube.
Well, to your point about the set list, they weren't really digging deep into their repertoire at this point. I think they were trying to get new fans. They were trying to expose the fans to their standards. I don't think there was a lot of Japanese doing what we were doing, where they were hitting every show. So this was not, we weren't going to get a Harpua, for example. We were going to get Golgi, things like that. So that was to be expected. And at this point in the tour, we realized that was happening and we were comfortable with it. And there was a lot of throwbacks. I mean, the reason why I picked this show is because it encapsulates the tour. So, both of these songs were played at the first night in Tokyo. First Tube was played 3 times. Again, on the Japanese tour, again, they were playing the hell out of the Farmhouse. And I just love First Tube. I think it is a rocker. And I saw the first Phish one, the first Phish debut in Vancouver, that 9999 show, and ever since then this has been one of my favorites. But it always usually comes at the end of a set, an encore. I thought it was really well placed at this past New Year's Eve, inside of an encore. I mean, it's really just a high energy number, but here it had almost a life of its own, where it was not by the numbers, because it was early in the first set, and it just it kind of peaks out. It's great.
Yeah, my notes say in all capital letters, a big mushy peak at 7 minutes. And I don't use the word mushy that often when describing First Tube. Usually it's sharp, right? And mushy, I don't mean that as a derogatory way. It's they kind of hint at these upper limits in 2000, where you start with a beat and you start with a melody, and before you know it, it's a lot of pedals and a lot of effects that kind of overtake each other and sample and double up on each other, to the point where as a listener, you're just blown away and your mind can't quite process it, but you enjoy it just as well. And after that is Golgi Apparatus that you mentioned. It's we're back to goofy classics, right? Not quite Harpua, but it does make things a little lighter after the drama of First Tube, and then Heavy Things. So we're in this very song-based set.
Heavy Things was another, 3-time played in Japan tour. It was the single being promoted.
Right.
And I just, I've loved it since I saw the Phish debut at the Gorge, that fall tour 99. And, just such a fun song. I wasn't crazy when they swapped in the piano solo for the guitar solo, but it's one of my favorites, or at least one of the, at least, of the songs that don't really jam out. I like it.
It's funny you say that, because one of my favorite things about Heavy Things, and this is starting in 2013, I think it was the Halloween show in 2013, was the first time I heard that they swapped out the guitar solo and Page was playing the organ in its place. And I thought, oh, this is nice and new. But of course, at that point, the song was 13 years old. So maybe it was the novelty of it at the time.
It's funny because, again, attendance bias, this being such a theme song of the Japan tour, when I hear them play it, I'm brought right back there. But then when they don't go into the guitar solo, I'm like, wait a second, where am I? I'm somewhere. I'm not where I thought I was. And I do, look, you have to give so much respect to the band for mixing it up and keeping it fresh. But that was one aspect of this song that I probably would have preferred stayed static.
And then we cool things down a bit with Dirt. And it hit me at this point listening that this is a very late 90s set list. If you kind of threw it all into a pile and then just randomly picked out different songs played between 1999 and 2000, a lot of these would be chosen in that pool. But I suppose that that never changes. Like the newer songs almost always get the preferential treatment. No matter, you mentioned Ghosts of the Forest. We started talking about it early in this conversation, right? In 2019 or so, those were the new songs. So what's old is
Right.
new.
And then Lonely Trip, and right now we're seeing Oblivion. Right, it's sort of best of times and the worst of times being a Phish fan, right? Because they're always reinvigorating themselves. And I've fallen off, during the Wingsuit Big Boat, I kind of fell off a little, but now with Ghost and Lonely, I'm right back in. So that's it's their music and their fan base, it's fluid. And I think that's one of the things that's made them so great and have them stand the test of time.
And after Dirt, things get picked back up a little bit with My Sweet One. I always love seeing this on a set list, and of course hearing it when I'm in person, but like a 2.5 minute bluegrass song that ends with incredible vocal harmonies that I will never ever get sick of. I associate it with Golgi Apparatus because even though they're a few years apart, they're still, I think I would categorize both of them as early Phish, right? Capital E, capital P as an era. And then things stretch out really for the first time since Limb by Limb with Reba.
Right. I mean, this is, the Reba, this is the first one in Japan. And even the first My Sweet One, the My Sweet One hadn't even been played at Fuji. And so, they're gonna serve that up. And the Japanese fans were loving it. With Reba, when it hits that chill part, it locks into that Japanese sound. And it's so melodic and just, blissful and absolutely spectacular.
Yeah, I was wondering how the Japanese fans received it, but I think you've made a really strong point that that does not get lost in translation, right? It must have felt very comfortable, like even though you're halfway across the world, you must have felt at home while the show is being played. Am I right to assume that?
That's right, especially because at that point I had seen, dozens of Phish shows. And so it felt very familiar. And especially at that point of the tour, because we had really bonded with not only the other Americans and Canadians, but with the we had made friends with Japanese. So looking around, we saw a lot of familiar faces. And of course, Phish playing this familiar music. It was pretty wild being literally on the other side of the earth, but feeling at home. But when we go back to Japan now, I have that feeling, right? Because I have family there.
Right. Now you're part of it. You have those ties, absolutely. And you told your story about the set closer with Character Zero. And this is fun, straight, energetic rock and roll, crowd pleasing stuff. I imagine that no matter who was in the crowd, this must have been a really big, exciting closer. Because at the time it was not a new song, but it wasn't yet, forgive me, played out as a set closer, as you might argue today.
Yeah, absolutely. This was, high energy closer. The Japanese fans were absolutely ecstatic, although you couldn't necessarily tell by watching them because they weren't, jumping around. But and this had been played 3 times that tour. I think this is exactly the sort of song that Phish wanted to show to the Japanese fans. This is what we're all about. This is what we're capable of. And I told my Hibiya Rainbow story, but before we get to set 2, I want to tell another Japanese story that I just remembered, which was I had a terrible idea to stay in a capsule hotel. And so after the first night in Tokyo, I actually went back and spent the night in one of these like tube type things. I was looking to save money. I thought it might be a cool experience. What I didn't realize was that it's really for the Japanese. They work very hard and they miss their last train home, but it's not really a place to, decompress after a concert. And so during Dirt, when they sang A Tiny Space to Move and Breathe, I just cracked up thinking about what a terrible idea that was to spend that first night in that capsule hotel. And I got out of there very quickly.
Hi, everybody. Brian here to welcome you to the set break of today's episode of Attendance Bias. First, thank you for listening. And second, just a quick reminder to tell you that even though Attendance Bias comes to you for free, it does take a lot of work and it does take quite a bit of money to keep the lights on here at production. So I just wanted to ask a small favor if you could support the podcast in any number of the following ways. If you could leave a review or a rating of it on whichever podcast app you use. If you could spread the word, telling a friend or someone you think may be interested in it about it. Or probably the most concrete way is to go to www.buymeacoffee.com/attendancebias and donate however much you can financially to help with the continuing costs of Attendance Bias. So thank you again so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the second half of today's episode.
Set 2.
Set 2 opens with Runaway Jim, and before I even pressed play on the recording, I noticed the timing of it. 26 minutes and 9 seconds. We said a little bit earlier during the first set that as far as Phish promoting themselves and playing a more accessible set list and not diving too deep, this, it's not like Runaway Jim is a rarity by any stretch, but a 26-minute set 2 opener, I'll take that anywhere, any country, any continent. And this one goes real deep. My notes on this Runaway Jim are about 5 paragraphs. This is a dense piece of music. What are your memories from this?
Well, yeah, this is the Jim plus the theme is like a 40-minute piece, monumental piece of music. And this was the highlight of the show and maybe of the whole run. I don't have attendance bias for Fukuoka, but from what I saw, this was absolutely spectacular. And both of these classics were played for the first time in Japan, and they were paired perfectly. And the Jim, it just launches right into type 2 with that Japan signature sound. And what was to me most memorable, because I remember I wasn't on the floor. It was like I was on the rail of one level up. And I remember Trey turning to his little keyboard, which he doesn't seem to use too much these days. and he starts doing all of these really high-tech futuristic sounds. So it sounded like R2-D2, and
Yeah.
Japan being such a futuristic place. And again, so we're seeing these cultural elements getting folded into the jam.
And these are the sort of soundscapes. That's the word that comes up a lot when you talk about Phish in 2000, that would develop into these 30-minute jams throughout the summer and early fall. When I saw them at Darien Lake, a show that's fairly well known after it was released on Live Phish, September 14th, 2000, the second set opens with a version of Drowned that just goes on forever. And if I were trying to get somebody into Phish, it'd be the last thing I would play for them. It's what I tend to call graduate level Phish. It's not beginner stuff. And that's what this version of Runaway Jim reminded me of.
I mean, look, Jim had been a launching pad for them for years, right? Going back to Worcester. So, we weren't surprised that it, went into outer space. But here it was like, it almost felt as if we were all sort of floating above the islands of Japan, the way that the jam was sequenced. We were paying very close attention to it, and it just sort of melts into the theme from the bottom. And that was another one that we were waiting for. And it just that segue is just it's impossible for me to think of these as separate songs. Theme just after the kind of the song part, it just lifts and lifts melodically until about the 9.5 minute mark. You start hearing robot noises again. So that was, there was a lot of that, technological, futuristic sounds. When I think of theme, I'm actually a scuba diver. And I think most of us think about, the ocean, and
Sure.
Japan is famously, island nation. You think of the famous painting, The Great Wave off Kanagawa. So that's really kind of where we all were at that point during that 40-minute segment to open the second set.
And I have to imagine it was wonderful to appreciate this 40-minute segment in real time, because by the time Phish got back to America in the summer and fall, and they were playing these same soundscapes and this type of music, they were playing it in much larger venues. So if you were on the lawn or if you were indoors and were all the way upstairs, maybe block from some of the sound, it could get boring. You could get lost. But if you're in an 800 person to 1,500 person club, it's probably a lot easier to kind of keep track of it as it goes and appreciate it from where it starts to where it ends. Whereas we're lucky whenever they release anything from this era on soundboard, at least from America, because if you were there in the first place, maybe you might have missed something because this is dense stuff.
Well, I was just going to cut to the chase, which is that fevered intensity of that block of music really needed a chill landing spot, and they served it up perfectly with Dogface Boy and Driver. And to your point about the quiet room, I think at this point they realized, okay, this is the last time, for, as it turns out, decades, when they were going to have such a quiet, attentive audience, and they could really do these back-to-back ballads justice.
Right. Dog-Faced Boy, Driver, a really nice back-to-back break. This is one of my favorites. Driver is, I like Dog-Faced Boy also, but Driver really, I think the wordplay and the lyrics are so clever and so cheeky. They're very fun. It's underplayed, but it pairs very well with Dog-Faced Boy. This is a nice little pair here before going into Slave to the Traffic Light.
I was really excited because that was my only Dogface Boy, and still to date in 135 shows. So that was nice to be able to check that box. And of course, they reference nearby Hanoi. And the Driver, I agree with you. Driver to me is some of the best lyrics, some of maybe Tom's best lyrics. What was really cool was they had released a Japanese version of Farmhouse that we all picked up, because the way they issue Japanese bootlegs is they always add a studio track or two, and we all had the studio Driver. And this was before you could pull it up on YouTube, right? So we bought the CD with the the Japanese version, and we were listening, and it was just magical that we were able to listen to the studio Driver, and Mountains in the Mist was the other studio track. I don't know why they left them off Farmhouse, but it was a treat for us to listen to those. And then right immediately after those two, they picked it right back up with Slave to the Traffic Light. And this is kind of summed up all the frustration and pride that we had experienced navigating these Japanese cities, between the language barrier, the alphabet barrier. It was just dizzying, right? Because there was so much travel involved in such a short period of time.
And Slave to the Traffic Light, when I was listening to the show, to the set straight through, I thought it feels strange that we're already at the end of the set, but man, Runaway Jim was long. So we're already not quite at the very end of the set, but we're, rounding third base. We're starting the fourth quarter right now. And I really like, musically speaking, how forward Mike's bass is, not just in the mix, but in the melody. Like, Mike is not to be ignored, even though most of the jamming at this point is very high up in terms of levels, in terms of range, where a lot of it is based on Page and Trey.
Right. No, this was a collective effort, right? I mean, we were, especially in such a small place, we were really feeling, Mike's bass just, reverberating through us. Trey's, droning abilities were really going through the roof at this point. And right, I think the thought may have crossed my mind, because I typically see Slave, as a set closer, that maybe this is it. but it was just in the middle of the set. But I think the sense was, okay, we're on the downward slope, not only of this show, but of this whole tour, this whole experience.
Yeah, talking about set closers, I thought, like you said, I thought Slave would, if not end it, pretty much bring it home. But then we have two consecutive set closers in Julius and Bug, which were both late 90s standards. Bug, I noticed, I looked it up while we were listening, was played 14 times in 2000, almost always as a set closer, by the way.
Right. Look, these were kind of bonus tracks at this point, right?
Yeah.
But they were really welcome. I think Julius is not one of my favorite songs, but the lyric, "Don't take another step, wake up in the morning, you'll be gone," that was kind of a signal that, this whole experience is wrapping up. I mean, I flew out the next day. If you listen to the sound check of this show, Trey talks about leaving the next day, and he kept repeating, "I can't wait to go back home." And it's like, well, wait, here he is on the other side of the world playing some of the best music, not only that he's ever played, but that's ever been played. Why is he in a rush to get home? But I felt that, right? It was exhilarating and epic, but it was also exhausting. And there was such a long journey back impending. You kind of just wanted to speed through that and be back in bed. And then there's something about Bug, which is another sort of Japan anthem. And I'm wearing a shirt from the Japan tour. It says "overrated" on the front. And I was gifted this, I don't know if it was at the airport or quickly upon arrival, but it was great because just that "overrated" line. I mean, here we are between the brilliant playing and the cultural bombardment of this global adventure, just to look at one another and be like, yeah, overrated, and laugh and smile.
Right, ready to go home. And the encore, they come back on for a really short fan favorite, Bouncing Around the Room, classic, always enjoyable. And then Harry Hood, which is 14 minutes long. They're not just trying to rush to get out of there. They take their time with this Harry Hood. The guitar breaks off the main rhythm, but like only for a short while. Like this is nothing outstanding or unusual, but to me, this reminded me of like a quick running stream. There was forward motion in this jamming. It's very even. And then toward the end, there's like this big build, as there almost always is, and rounds the corner to the ending. This is an awesome version of Harry Hood, not to be ignored in the big jams that came earlier in the show.
Oh, absolutely. This is majestic, right? And it is sort of the cherry on the sundae of the Japan tour. There's nothing aggressive or showy about this Hood, or really Phish is playing this whole tour. And this double encore, Bouncing Harry, two Phish classics that had already been played earlier in the tour. So again, that's my take, is that this show, was a summation of the tour, which is why I picked it for attendance bias. They were playing to and influenced by the Japanese, and it just makes for such a unique Phish run. And, my attendance bias is that this is peak Phish. This sort of cohesive unit is their pinnacle musically and culturally, right? I wasn't at Big Cypress, which is understood as the reason why Phish took the hiatus. People were saying, well, what else could they accomplish? Well, this is what they could and did accomplish. And so when the final show was released this last year, and I listened to this one, and then I went back and I listened to all the others, and I just realized what a incredible moment in my life and in Phish history, and all of us who were lucky enough to be in attendance. So that's why I reached out and I said I want to get on your podcast and talk about this show.
Well, Jordan, I'm glad you did reach out. Thank you so much for doing so and taking us not just through a show, but through a tour and through a continent, through an entire country, as we discussed so much, but focused mostly on June 16th, 2000 at Zepp Suminoe-ku in Osaka. But really, this was just one dipping our toes in the water, like one small example. I think this episode was more about the tour than about the show. The show is just a stepping point to kind of pinpoint like a really important and unique spot in Phish's history. So thank you for coming on and being our tour guide for that.
Domo arigato, Brian-san.
Arigato.
Really appreciate you having me on here, and just want to take a minute and say how much I appreciate your podcast. Your attention to detail and your enthusiasm is a real contribution to the Phish community. And keep it going. Sayonara.
And that's it for today's conversation with Jordan. And it is time for the attendance bias fact check. Although, as you could probably tell, Jordan did his research, so it's a surprisingly short fact check today.
Attendance bias fact check.
First, the experimental limb by limb that opens today's show is not the longest song in the first set. It clocks in at 15 minutes and 48 seconds, while Reba, toward the end of the set, just edges it out at 16 minutes and 13 seconds. Jordan mentioned that he saw the Phish debut of Heavy Things at the Gorge. That show was on September 11th, 1999, as the song was played toward the end of the first set, right before Gaiute and Free. When talking about Runaway Jim being a launching pad for the band's jams, Jordan mentions Worcester. He is referring to the version of Runaway Jim that opened the second set on November 29th, 1997 at the Worcester Centrum, also known as Runaway Jam. The track is timed at 58 minutes and 49 seconds and is believed to be the longest Phish jam within a single song played to date. And that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Jordan Kahn for joining me today, Phish.net for its help with the fact check, the Mockingbird Foundation for everything it does to further music education, and Phish.in for the recording used in today's episode. If you enjoy Attendance Bias, you could always follow it on social media and visit www.buymeacoffee.com/attendancebias and donate anything you can. Again, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Attendance Bias.